Kiedy jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni i wszystkie słowa wypowiedziane.
Tato!
Bo jesteś naszym wrogiem.
Find a car, we'll take him. Find a car, we'll take him to the hospital.
Zanim na Gori I inne miasta...
Before bombs fell on Gori and other Georgian cities, killing ordinary people in the streets of this country, here in Bucharest, in the building erected by Nicolae Ceausescu, the communist dictator, the Western world listened to Vladimir Putin's words, who warned that countries such as Georgia or Ukraine entering NATO will pose a threat for the Russian Federation.
Wejście państw takich jak Gruzja czy Ukraina do NATO będzie stanowić zagrożenie dla Federacji Rosyjskiej.
There was a European German political activist, Bismarck, who said that it is potential and not intention that counts in matters such as this. Nobody overruled Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, and we liquidated base in Cam Ranh, Vietnam, in Cuba. We withdrew our troops from Eastern Europe. We withdrew almost all large and heavy equipment from the European part. What did we get in return? Bases in Romania, where we currently are. Bases in Bulgaria. The positioning of American missile defense in Poland and the Czech Republic. It is all a movement towards our borders, our military infrastructure.
W kierunku naszych granic infrastruktury wojskowej.
Te słowa
These were the words expressed during the NATO-Russia summit after the NATO summit itself was concluded in the very same place. Their effect was not difficult to predict. 4 months later, Russia invaded Georgia.
wśród kluczowych spraw, jakimi
Among the key issues dealt with by NATO leaders here in Bucharest during the 2008 summit was the issue of Georgia, but also Ukraine and their membership in NATO. Before the summit began, preparations for the summit were underway in many NATO member states, including in Poland. However, the documents collected in Polish archives show that not all centres of power in Poland were preparing for this summit in the same way back then, in 2008.
W roku 2008 przygotowywały się do tego szczytu w taki sam sposób. Po powrocie Donalda Tuska z Moskwy,
After Donald Tusk returned from Moscow from the meeting in early February 2008, the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs continued work on creating documents that would execute the new philosophy of relations presented at the Kremlin. A note by Jarosław Bratkiewicz titled Theses on the Policy of the Republic of Poland Towards Russia and Ukraine is such a document. This document was to shape Polish Eastern policy for the coming years and also directly influence the approach to issues discussed during the NATO summit in Bucharest. The context is important. The moment when the memo of Jarosław Bratkiewicz, head of the Department of Eastern Policy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was created. It was the 4th of March 2008, so just a month before the NATO summit in Bucharest. The memo was of a conceptual nature. The memo concerns an issue that was absolutely fundamental from the point of view of Poland's foreign policy and from the point of view of the reorientation of Poland's foreign policy, which took place as a result of Prime Minister Donald Tusk taking over. In the past, especially during the government of Law and Justice, as a result of shallow analyses and assessments, as well as often demagogic judgments promoted by the media, a certain scheme was established of perceiving and presenting Russia and Ukraine, as well as the objectives of Polish policy in relation to both these countries. It concerns the policy towards Russia and Ukraine. It is significant that both of these foreign policy directions were connected in his reflections. It must be said that Bratkiewicz distances himself from the entire earlier policy towards Russia and Ukraine, which was pursued by various Polish governments. The anti-law and justice nature of this part of the memo is merely elusive. Actually, it is disassociating from the entire so-called Jagiellonian concept of Poland's foreign policy.
Umownie nazywanej jagiellońskiej koncepcji polityki zagranicznej Polski. Mianowicie to jest polemika.
Namely, it is a polemic with the statement that Russia is Poland's enemy, that there will be a permanent conflict between Poland and Russia, that the conflict is somehow permanent and cannot be resolved. And what is the most important assumption that this new philosophy has understood by Bratkiewicz? Primarily that Russia is not aggressive, that Russia is modernizing. Russia fears China, so it turns towards the West. In other words, Bratkiewicz believes that Russia will tame its imperial aggressive intentions, because its strategic goal is the durability of a tactical, pragmatic alliance with the West. And that's why Bratkiewicz claims that Russia does not have any aggressive territorial plans.
Taktycznego, pragmatycznego z Zachodem. No i w związku z tym Bratkiewicz twierdzi, że Rosja nie ma żadnych agresywnych zamiarów terytorialnych.
The possibilities of Russia's expansion in political and economic sense, not to mention militarily, are quite limited. They face serious impediments in the CIS states, such as Ukraine and Georgia. In turn, Moscow's ability to influence the Central and Eastern European countries belonging to the EU and NATO is negligible or non-existent. A few days after drafting this document, on the 10th of March 2008, Donald Tusk spoke to George Bush, the US president in Washington. We know the record of this conversation, and that is where George Bush asked the question. Let me ask you a delicate question. Who will represent Poland at the NATO summit? President Kaczynski. We share our view on the NATO summit and the alliance enlargement. We have identical views here. As a political group, we look at it exactly the same as President Lech Kaczynski. Is this true? We must say at the beginning that this is not true. However, the presence of Radosław Sikorski at this meeting is an exceptionally significant circumstance. I managed to decipher the date added by Radosław Sikorski as the foreign minister on Bratkiewicz' document. He confirms reading or receiving this note and, in my opinion, getting acquainted with it, as actually confirmed by Radosław Sikorski's handwritten annotation, that is, on the 8th of March, 2 days before the meeting of Donald Tusk with George Bush at the White House. The spirit of this philosophy, which at this moment begins to translate into a written concept of Poland's foreign policy towards Russia and Ukraine, I emphasize that it is also included in Bratkiewicz' memo. It is already very well known to the foreign minister.
On jest już bardzo dobrze znany ministrowi spraw zagranicznych. Oczywiście pozostaje pytanie.
Of course, the question remains how much Prime Minister Donald Tusk knew about it. But no doubt, since November 2007, Prime Minister Tusk has been following in the same spirit, but saying that concerning MAP. the Membership Action Plan.
W kwestii mapu nie ma sporu. Między jego ekipą a prezydentem Lechem Kaczyńskim jest nieporozumieniem.
There was no dispute between his team and President Lech Kaczynski. It's a complete misunderstanding, as it was fundamental dispute in general in the way Ukraine was perceived. Obviously, it concerns the Russian objectives concerning MAP for Ukraine and Georgia. Yet it was also a fundamental dispute with President Lech Kaczynski, who actually believed that Poland must play a role of messiah, advocate of Ukrainian and Georgian international interests.
I gruzińskich na forum międzynarodowym.
MAP, Membership
Action Plan, is a roadmap for joining the North Atlantic Treaty, a NATO program, the fate of which was to be decided by the NATO summit.
Gruzja i Ukraina.
Georgia and Ukraine wanted to join the program so that their path to NATO would be decided. Lech Kaczynski had a clear view that it should be done as soon as possible.
Jak najszybciej należy to zrealizować.
Sposób postrzegania Ukrainy jest.
The way Ukraine is seen is very similar to the way Russia sees it. Because in this memo and in numerous later considerations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ukraine seems to be a fallen state, a state incapable of modernizing itself. Bratkiewicz believes that the West, or this concept of Western powers, primarily Germany and France, perceives Ukraine the way he does.
Mocarstw zachodnich, przede wszystkim Niemiec i Francji, tak postrzega Ukrainę, jak on. I w zasadzie Ukraina ze względu na to,
And in fact, Ukraine, due to the condition it is in, has no chance to integrate with the West. Thus, the reorientation of Polish policy towards Moscow does not lead to any consequences associated with Ukraine, as Ukraine dooms itself to failure in all of this geopolitical, regional European game in relations to the Russian Federation, as it is a fallen, rotting, weak state, actually without a possibility of standing on its feet.
Upadłe, gnijące, słabe, tak naprawdę bez możliwości stanięcia na nogi, to polska polityka nie powinna być.
Polish policy should not be characterized by certain messianism towards Ukraine. It should be more passive, supporting all these modernizing and democratic factors. But it should absolutely not be, as per the memo, Ukraine's advocate in its relations primarily with NATO, but also with the EU, because Ukraine itself has to answer this question. An appearance of realism, which really hides the pro-Russian reorientation of Donald Tusk's policy.
Powyższe uwarunkowania nadają
These
określoną
conditions render the Ukrainian declarations on its pro-Western orientation and membership in the EU and NATO somewhat ambiguous. Based on previous experience, one may get the impression that they serve the needs of internal Ukrainian political battles as a sign of the West's acceptance for one party or another, rather than the real adaptation and thus modernization plans. In this context, the Ukrainian authorities often use Polish promotion and apology of Ukraine in the West instrumentally.
apologię Ukrainy na Zachodzie.
Tezy Jarosława Bratkiewicza
Radosław Sikorski accepts as his own the theses of Jarosław Bratkiewicz, a graduate of the Moscow MGIMO school, turning upside down the previous Polish policy towards Russia and Ukraine. He creates their abridged version of his office paper and informs the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, about them. This document remained unknown for years. We present it to you for the first time. The first days of April 2008 are the NATO summit in Bucharest. Here, in the Foreign Ministry's archives, very interesting letters concerning key points raised during the summit have been preserved. On the 26th of March 2008, President Lech Kaczynski wrote a letter to the Greek Prime Minister, a letter about the position on the NATO summit.
W najbliższych dniach
In the coming days, heads of state and government of NATO member states will meet in Bucharest to take decisions on key and pivotal issues for the pact. The most important issues to be discussed will certainly include NATO's open door policy. Europe must not forget Ukraine and Georgia again. No decision on including these countries by MAP will prove losing the awareness of the alliance's goals and its political significance for European security. We cannot let this happen.
państwa Europy. Nie możemy na to pozwolić.
The very form in which this document was kept in the Foreign Ministry's archives says a lot about the nature of relations between the President, the Prime Minister, and the government in matters concerning Russian interests. The President's letter, dated the 26th of March 2008, addressed to the Prime Minister of Greece, was handed over to the Foreign Ministry by the Presidential Chancellery on the 27th of March. The letter was urgent, and the President requested that the Prime Ministers or the letter addressees are informed about the Polish position before the 1st of April.
Poinformować premierów czy adresata tego listu o stanowisku państwa polskiego.
W związku z udziałem prezydenta
Due to the
RP
participation of the Polish President, Mr. Lech Kaczynski, in the Bucharest NATO summit from the 2nd to the 4th of April 2008, I attach a letter of the President to heads of state and governments of NATO member states, requesting urgent delivery to the addressees by diplomatic channels before the 1st of April. This yellow post-it note has been preserved on the document, with the following wording.
W następujący sposób.
Prośba od dyrektora króla.
Request from Director Krull, after speaking to Minister Radosław Sikorski. This document is to be kept in our safe cabinet until Monday and await further instructions from Minister Radosław Sikorski.
Data 31 marca.
Signature dated March the 31st, which is Monday. The NATO Bucharest summit was to begin on April the 2nd, 2008.
2 kwietnia 2008 roku.
Such a note is simply a scandal, an incredible scandal.
Ale ja sobie wyobrażam, że to jest, że tutaj...
But I can imagine that time is crucial here. If the President wrote it, it was urgent. Yes, hence the order to make it urgent. It was so routine that it did not even require any additional pressure from the Chancellery, as it was so obvious that if the President saw something as urgent and associated with the scheduled NATO summit, well, it seems absolutely obvious.
NATO, który się ma odbyć, no to sprawa była absolutnie oczywista.
What is the significance of this document lying among documents for 4 or 5 days and being sent, even, say, on Monday? How does this alter the situation? It simply will not be delivered on time for it to be taken seriously by its recipients. This was an act against the Polish national interest, and it makes Poland ridiculous in general.
Czego dotyczy marcowy list?
And what does President Lech Kaczynski's March letter to Western leaders, scheduled to arrive in Bucharest in the first days of April, refer to? Well, it concerns one issue only. That, within some clearly defined perspective, Georgia and Ukraine should be admitted to the family of Western states, free and secure thanks to NATO membership.
Państw zachodnich, wolnych i bezpiecznych dzięki uczestnictwu w Pakcie Północnoatlantyckim. Zatrzymanie tego listu było dokładnie grą obliczoną na...
Detaining the letter was exactly aimed at fostering the German and French political agenda. Hiding the letter and failing to let it into the international diplomatic flow by not sending it on time when it should have been posted, blocking it, was sabotage. It was sabotage simply against the interests of Poland and the United States. And obviously, it is important to simply emphasize, especially today, in the year 2023, against Ukraine and Georgia.
Ważne jest, żeby to po prostu podkreślić, zwłaszcza dzisiaj, w roku 2023, przeciwko Ukrainie i przeciwko Gruzji.
Wszelkie opóźnianie i
Any
utrudnienie
delays and obstructions keeping in safe cabinets the position which was to be sent the NATO summit decision makers concerning the membership of Georgia and Ukraine surely fit into the new line, according to which the Polish state wanted to build new relations, a new philosophy of reset with Russia, which is explicitly against NATO membership of Georgia and Ukraine.
jednoznacznie przeciwna była członkostwu Gruzji i Ukrainy w NATO. Właśnie dlatego wszelkie aktywności prezydenta
That
Rzeczpospolitej...
is why all the activities of the Polish President Lech Kaczynski to the benefit of Georgia or Ukraine were torpedoed by the Polish government.
Polskę na szczycie NATO...
Poland was represented at the NATO summit here in Bucharest by Lech Kaczynski. Together with the US President, they were to convince other members of the alliance to accept Ukraine and Georgia, as the two were the most controversial. Not just due to the Russian objections, but primarily because of the position of France and Germany.
Otwarta dyskusja przede wszystkim o sprawie
An important discussion, first of all, about MAP for Georgia and Ukraine. Poland is strongly in favour of granting MAP to these two countries. It is also the question of who has the right to decide on the size of NATO. Those countries that want to belong, or some other countries perhaps. Of course, Poland holds the position that it is the countries that want to belong to NATO.
że te państwa, które chcą do NATO należeć.
That these two countries are and will remain sovereign and independent states. Here in Bucharest, we need to say clearly that NATO welcomes Georgia and Ukraine's membership aspirations and offers them a clear path to achieve this goal. Thus, the position of my country is clear. NATO should welcome Georgia and Ukraine to the Membership Action Plan. NATO membership must remain open to all European democracies that seek it and are ready to share the responsibilities resulting from NATO membership. The collective security of our citizens is NATO's primary responsibility.
Najważniejszym obowiązkiem NATO jest kolektywne bezpieczeństwo naszych obywateli.
However, neither the position of the United States nor that of Poland proved decisive for the final conclusions. Germany and France had a completely different idea on the issue. Here's what Ukraine's President, Viktor Yushchenko, said about it. The Ukrainian issue was the first to be considered. When we got the draft resolution, the first shock came.
Pojawił się pierwszy szok. Dokument był dramatyczny.
The document was dramatic. A lot of words, mostly empty.
W większości pustych, w których nawet nie wspomniano, że obydwa
Not
kraje
even
są
mentioning that
krajami
both countries are European. And that our policy, not just security policy, has a very specific European direction.
Ma bardzo konkretny europejski kierunek. Nie było o tym żadnego
There was no
słowa.
mention of it.
To
It was
było
offensive.
obraźliwe.
My first comment to my colleague and friend George Bush, I cannot return to Ukraine with such a resolution.
George'owi Bushowi. Z taką rezolucją nie mogę wrócić do Ukrainy.
It was very humiliating.
To było coś bardzo upokarzającego. Rozumiałem, że musi być jakaś reakcja na to. Porozmawialiśmy chyba z
I understood that there had to be a reaction to that. We spoke to some 8 or 10 presidents. We waited for the break, instructed by the US president, and we spoke to the 2 main states opposing a resolution that was good for us. It was Germany and France.
Z dwoma czołowymi państwami, które sprzeciwiały się dobrej dla nas rezolucji. To były Niemcy i Francja.
Dyplomacja niemiecka,
German diplomacy, or German policy in general at that time, that is the first quarter of 2008, was aimed at destroying the American concept, the one of George Bush, of MAP for Ukraine and Georgia. This George Bush concept of MAP for Ukraine at the NATO summit in Bucharest was also the concept of Polish policy, only in the dimension of the policy of President Lech Kaczynski. Of course, it was also part of the political agenda of Lithuania and Romania, but it was met with, so to say, a counter-offensive of German and French diplomacy.
natomiast spotkała się z, że tak powiem, kontrofensywą dyplomacji niemieckiej i dyplomacji francuskiej.
We believe that this is not the time to realise the MAP, but rather we want to help both these countries come closer to this path. We recently made a political statement. We believe Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. Yet, on the other hand, we clearly said that it required a balanced process in order for the criteria to be met. We have agreed with everyone that we need an additional phase of intense commitment of all parties to help Ukraine and Georgia take the next step towards, that is, the MAP.
Jednakże za każdym razem będziemy
Every time, however, we will assess the progress made. The first assessment of this progress as part of the new phase, which will be moving towards MAP, because we believe we have not yet arrived there yet, will be presented at the next Foreign Ministers meeting in December. Georgia and Ukraine should join the alliance, but we need time for the conditions to be met.
Wiktor Juszczenko w taki
Here's
sposób...
how Viktor Yushchenko describes his conversation with Angela Merkel. We started a brief conversation.
Będę ją pamiętał.
I will remember her for the rest of my life.
Przede mną stała inna Merkel, bo
A
znaliśmy
different
się
Merkel
jeszcze z lat
stood before me.
80.
As we knew each other from the 2000s when I was in the opposition. We were both right-wing politicians.
Prawicy.
We cooperated.
Współpracowaliśmy,
We knew each
znaliśmy
other
się
well.
dobrze.
З Ангелою ми були знайомі і знайомі непогано. І коли
Zapytałem ją,
I asked her why such a resolution draft had been
dlaczego tak
proposed.
wygląda projekt rezolucji.
на моє запитання, чому ми маємо таку резолюцію,
She answered,
каже,
Ona odparła,
Victor, you don't have enough people who support joining NATO.
у вас мало
macie za mało ludzi, którzy wspierają przystąpienie do NATO.
емоції інтегрування до НАТО.
A to oznacza, że Angela Merkel
Which means that during the summit, Angela Merkel used exactly the same argument to Viktor Yushchenko that Vladimir Putin publicly used 3 weeks earlier when he hosted her in Moscow. Putin said that at the time, as reported by the Polish military attaché in Moscow in a memo, that in his opinion, citizens of countries such as Ukraine oppose joining the NATO.
jej wejściu do Paktu Północnoatlantyckiego.
А я їй кажу, нас 31%.
Ja powiedziałem,
I said now
teraz
31% of Ukrainians
31%
support our NATO
Ukraińców
membership.
wspiera nasze
And then
członkostwo w NATO.
I explained. For example, 2 years ago, just 14% of people in Ukraine voted to joining
Za
NATO.
przystąpieniem do NATO w Ukrainie zagłosowało tylko 14% ludności.
Now, as many as 31%.
Aż
Is that bad
31%.
dynamics? I see it
To
as
jest
great
zła
dynamics.
dynamika.
And
Myślę,
I
że
add,
to wspaniała dynamika.
moreover, the number of
Jeszcze
people
dodaję,
not
co
supporting
więcej,
joining NATO
liczba
is
osób, które nie
29%.
popierają
That is the
przystąpienia,
first time that the number of
29%.
opponents is smaller than that of membership
To jest po raz
supporters.
pierwszy, kiedy liczba przeciwników jest mniejsza niż liczba popierających członkostwo. Mówię do niej, to wyjątkowa
I
sytuacja.
told her that the situation is exceptional and that it is just about MAP. If they told us that in 2 months Ukraine must carry out a referendum for membership and that there is no chance, I would even understand that.
To jeszcze bym zrozumiał.
Я б ще послухав вас. Хоча я переконаний, що наша динаміка і далі.
Przecież chodzi tylko o
But it is just about the MAP, about the action plan. That is no membership, but merely a step towards it.
Підходить до членства. Хіба так гостро можна ставити обставини?
Rozmowa z 45 milionami obywateli
Talking to
Ukrainy
45 million citizens of Ukraine is not talking with, for example, 3 million. It has the largest territory in Europe, which in its history turned out to be under the largest Russification. No one experienced what Ukraine survived.
nie przeżył tego, co przeżyła Ukraina.
Ніхто не переживав, крім України.
Winą za
Viktor Yushchenko blames the fact that MAP was not granted to Ukraine and Georgia on these two politicians, Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy.
i Nicolasa Sarkoziego.
Я розумів, що
Zdawałem sobie
I realized that they, France and Germany, had a common policy on this matter. I think that these two persons are to blame. Thought, through what is happening now, that we are facing a Russian aggression. At the time, Europe, represented by the leaders of the two largest countries, couldn't say anything about membership perspectives for Georgia and Ukraine.
wiedzieć nic wobec perspektywy członkostwa dla Gruzji oraz Ukrainy.
W trakcie obrad tego szczytu nie
The
tylko
Georgian
w czasie
President,
spotkań z
Mikhail
politykami,
Saakashvili,
ale również w
spoke on
konferencji
several
prasowej
occasions
głos
during the
zabierał
summit,
wielokrotnie
not just during
Mikhail
meetings with
Saakashvili,
politicians,
prezydent
but
Gruzji.
also at press conferences.
Nasza przyszłość jest związana z NATO.
Our future is associated with NATO, the most powerful and successful military alliance in history that unites and defends the free nations of the world. We want to see Georgia among these nations. That is why we work so closely with NATO in Iraq, Afghanistan and the former Yugoslavia. Our goal is to achieve full NATO membership. NATO guarantees Georgian integrity and inviolability of our borders. For our children, our grandchildren, and for all our generations. Finally, the NATO summit adopted different conclusions than those expected by France and Germany. In the opinion of Anna Fotiga, who participated in the talks at the time, the final shape of the conclusions gave the possibility of Georgia and Ukraine for joining NATO in the future. If we had a different government in Poland back then, I believe we would have pushed it and used all those gates that were there. This promise of a follow-up meeting, revised assessment in December. I remember the President dragging the leaders of countries of our region to a corner at that time. For various reasons, he asked me to interpret that meeting between them. And it was actually a short exchange of opinions. It turned out that both Angela Merkel and Condoleezza Rice joined, because it turned out that it was something that could disturb the willingness and the seemingly already established case.
I Angela Merkel, i Condoleezza Rice, bo się okazało, że to jednak jest coś, co może zaburzyć chęci i taką już wydawałoby się ustaloną sprawę. Nie, tam zapisy uległy.
No, the provisions have changed relative to what they originally wanted to write down. Yet this perspective remained, this membership promise. It did not become the final touch, which the MAP would be.
Tą kropką nad i byłby map.
Czyli powiedziałaby pani,
So you would say the door was not closed, and the foot was put in the door, and the door was not closed, while it was to be closed. Well, I think it was all aimed at that.
czy w kwestiach dotyczących polityki
Could the President count on government support in matters concerning the policy towards our partners from outside the EU and NATO, such as Georgia or Ukraine, at the time when President Kaczynski was president and the government was led by the Civic Platform Party?
Kiedy prezydentem był prezydent Kaczyński, a rządem kierowała partia Platforma Obywatelska.
Nie, niestety nie. Co było widać,
No, unfortunately not, which was visible. In fact, at the Bucharest summit in 2008, when Lech Kaczynski prevented NATO's door from being slammed for Ukraine and Georgia, that the door remained open, which was in fact mentioned in the statement issued by Lech Kaczynski after the summit. The statement was later belittled by the Civic Platform government.
Znalazło się w oświadczeniu, jakie wydał po tym szczycie Lech Kaczyński, a to oświadczenie było przez rząd Platformy Obywatelskiej dezawuowane potem.
Jestem usatysfakcjonowany.
I am satisfied. In particular, the last round of yesterday's discussion was successful. At the last moment, with Poland's significant contribution, the wording of the communiqué was changed. Even though previously we were told that all was possible was achieved, it turned out that we could achieve much more. Primarily, there is the statement that Ukraine and Georgia, which we also need to remember, will be NATO members. This is the most important statement. Specifically, the statement reads, they will become NATO members and not someday, as the original version read. This is truly a lot, and both President Yushchenko and Saakashvili expressed their great satisfaction with the summit's achievements. I am very pleased that Poland definitely played a significant part here in both negotiations phases.
Bardzo się cieszę, że Polska odegrała tutaj rolę zdecydowanie istotną i to w obydwu fazach negocjacji.
In his phenomenal book, A Little War That Shook the World, Georgia, Russia and the Future of the West, Ron Asmussen, a participant of these events and a US diplomat, thus described the diplomatic activities of President Lech Kaczynski at the summit. While the contents of the declaration were rewritten and the delegations in their full composition returned to the room, the Hubschäfer resumed the meeting. At that time, the Polish delegation began to hesitate. Someone realized that the statement, if they so wish, may easily be used against Ukraine, where public support for NATO membership was very poor. Kaczynski took to the floor and said that Poland would not agree to such wording of the document, and that the alliance should encourage rather than discourage Kiev from joining. This phrase was also deleted due to it being absolutely obvious. No country could become a NATO member against its will. Thus, Central and Eastern European leaders managed to negotiate with Merkel a better wording of the document than achieved by the US. And that is why President Lech Kaczynski said at the time that the game for Georgia and Ukraine in NATO was not yet over. The game would continue, but with MAP granted, the game would also have continued. This has to be made clear. Vladimir Putin arrived in Bucharest on the second day of the summit, and from the very beginning, he was treated like a rock star. Putin delivered a tirade in Bucharest, which undermined the sense of the North Atlantic Treaty existence. He stated that all objectives set by the pact can only be realized with the consent and acceptance of the Russian Federation, and thus the existence of NATO makes no sense. Speaking about the NATO enlargement policy, I spoke frankly about it in my meeting with my colleagues. You know our position, ladies and gentlemen. We do not believe that automatic enlargement leads to resolving contemporary problems. But when was NATO established? I spoke about it today too. At the time, when two blocs were confronted, when there was an empire of evil in the form of the Soviet Union. We need to wonder if this is the case and whether they were all equally right. Let's leave this part of the discussion. But we all know why NATO was created. Today, there is no Soviet Union, no Eastern Bloc, and no Warsaw Pact. Against whom does NATO exist then? We hear that the goal is to resolve contemporary problems and challenges. No proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. What can be done effectively about the issue without Russia? Nothing. Russia is one of the largest nuclear powers. Not only have we regained our nuclear potential, but we are also developing it, and we intend to continue developing the entire triad at sea, in the air and on the ground. And what can be done without Russia? Nothing. From the point of view of the fight against terrorism, what can be done with Russia? Well, some issues may perhaps be decided, yet effective fight is not likely. That is why the very existence of this bloc, despite it all, I believe many of those sitting in this room will agree with me, does not respond so effectively to contemporary threats and challenges. Still, it is a factor of contemporary international life, a factor of international security in the sphere of national security. We recognize that. Hence, we cooperate with this bloc. And since, in Putin's opinion, NATO is incapable of meeting any of its goals without Russia's consent, he set conditions and criticized NATO enlargement. And it was the enlargement to include Georgia and Ukraine that was the main subject of dispute during the summit. Concerning NATO enlargement, I heard today that it is not against Russia. You know, ladies and gentlemen, that I am very fond of European history, including German history. There was this great European German politician, Bismarck, who said that in such situations, what matters is not intention, but potential. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty has not been overruled. And we closed the bases in Cam, Vietnam, Cuba. We have withdrawn all of our military units from Eastern Europe, and we have withdrawn almost all of our large and heavy equipment from the European part. What did we get in return? Bases in Romania, where we currently are. Bases in Bulgaria. The position of the area of US missile defense in Poland and the Czech Republic. It is all a movement towards our borders, our military infrastructure.
Zdaniem Wiktora Juszczenki,
In the opinion of Viktor Yushchenko, the then president of Ukraine and participant of these talks, the second day of the summit and these decisions were a great political victory for Vladimir Putin.
A Putin przyleciał swoją drogą po południu.
Putin came by the way in the afternoon, as the NATO-Russia summit was held in the afternoon. Putin, inspired by a big victory at the beginning of the same day, for the first time after the Munich Security Conference in 2007.
W 2007 roku.
He gave a history lesson in which he explained to the assembled presidents that they should understand that Ukraine is an artificial country. Ukraine as a state did not exist. We gave it some territories in the east and the poles in the west, and thus Ukraine was created. So I believe it is right that you have made such a decision not to allow these two states. In a word, it was humiliating.
Uważam, że to jest słusznie, że podjęli państwo taką decyzję o niedopuszczeniu tych dwóch państw. Jednym słowem, to było upokarzające.
Znaleźliśmy
We found a very important document of the Polish Foreign Ministry. Specifically, it was an encrypted memo sent by the Ambassador Bar on the 21st of March 2008 to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Warsaw. Importantly, the document refers to the contents of a conversation between Witold Jurasz, a Polish diplomat, and head of the Department of America at the Russian Foreign Ministry, Igor Nievierov. a conversation which took place on the very same day.
Federacji Rosyjskiej Igorem Niewierowem. Rozmowy, która miała miejsce dokładnie.
They emphasized this in order to highlight the problem of conveying very important information to the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the moment when this information, significant not just for Poland, was established by the Polish diplomats in Moscow.
Kiedy ta informacja, istotna nie tylko dla Polski, została przez polskich dyplomatów w Moskwie powzięta.
Odnosząc się do mapy
Referring to MAP for Ukraine and Georgia, Niewierov quoted Putin, who supposedly told Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates that a possible NATO enlargement with both countries would ruin the Russia-US relations. Niewierov asked to explain what Russia would do specifically. He said nothing concerning the relationship between Russia and the US. In turn, he emphasized that it could lead to halving Ukraine, indicating the Crimea as a potential hotspot.
Rok 2008.
The year 2008, and this is a described scenario that came true. Yes, it was very clear signal hidden in February 2008, just a month earlier, by Polish diplomats and by Donald Tusk himself and by Radosław Sikorski, that Putin had real scenarios of destroying Ukraine, which he shared and sent or signalled it in talks with representatives of the West, including with representatives of Poland. It must be said that there was a completely different attitude of middle-level Polish diplomats who informed about this. And, secondly, of course, in the substantive sense, it is an outline of the exact scenario that had been realised. The Russian response to Ukraine being dragged into the zone of freedom of the West, so to say. In the structure of the North Atlantic Treaty, even in the form of MAP, would simply be met with the concept of destroying Ukraine, dismembering it.
W tym, że tak powiem, w struktury Paktu Północnoatlantyckiego, nawet w takiej formie jak MAP, spotkają się po prostu z koncepcją zniszczenia Ukrainy, rozczłonkowania jej.
Ta wiedza
This knowledge was present over a month earlier in the broadly understood structures of the Polish state. Yes, but over a month earlier it had been hidden. It had been hidden at the Foreign Ministry, at the Chancellery of the Prime Minister, and concealed in diplomatic relations between Poland and the US and in general with NATO allies and the EU.
I w ogóle z sojusznikami NATO i Unii Europejskiej.
It was the triumph of Putin's authoritarianism, and it became obvious that Europe suffered its first and profound failure of its previous policies in security terms.
Klęskę swojej dotychczasowej polityki.
І надзвичайно глибоку поразку своєї політики.
Niestety,
Unfortunately, we have already talked about it. 3 months later, Putin treated the decision of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly as consent to the occupation of Georgia.
po 3 miesiącach
3 months later, he invaded Georgia.
2 tygodnie po zakończeniu
2 weeks after the NATO summit ended, in mid-April 2008, the head of the presidential chancellery, Ania Fotyga, wrote a letter to the Foreign Ministry, requesting support of the statement of the President of the Republic of Poland concerning Georgia's territorial integrity threatened by the aggressive policy of the Russian Federation.
Federacji Rosyjskiej.
Kopia tego pisma.
A copy of this letter has been kept in the archives of the Foreign Ministry. The document reads as follows.
W dokumencie czytamy następujące słowa.
strategiczny wymiar
The
relacji.
strategic dimension of relations between the Republic of Poland and Georgia is a constant and invariable determinant of Poland's activities on the international forum. Guided by this belief, the President of the Republic of Poland expressed his deep concern over any attempts to violate Georgia's territorial integrity. I sincerely believe that within the framework of coordinated foreign policy, the government of the Republic Republic of Poland will express full support for a peaceful solution to the conflict, as advocated by President Mikhail Saakashvili, and will declare support for the activities of Georgian authorities in this regard. The Chancellery of the President of the Republic of Poland believes that the authorities of the Republic of Poland should appeal on the international forum to take as soon as possible all treaty-defined steps aimed at assuring the respect of Georgia's territorial integrity and sovereignty and the withdrawal of the Russian Federation's actions that violate its independence, breaching the international
Na
law.
tym piśmie zachowała się odręczna notatka.
A handwritten note, drafted by Radosław Sikorski, has been preserved on this letter.
Do Departamentu Prawno-Traktatowego.
To the Legal and Treaty Department, I request a draft reply indicating that such initiatives should be consulted in advance with the Foreign Ministry, and a statement on behalf of the state should be countersigned by the Prime Minister. Signature, Radosław Sikorski.
Polityka otwartych drzwi.
NATO's open door policy has been confirmed for a number of years in the position of all successive Polish governments, those which aspired to NATO, those which functioned already after the Polish ascension to NATO. All presidents, including President Kwaśniewski, President Kaczynski, also President Komorowski, even though later one might assess it differently, all recognized and accepted this policy. So, it was an indisputable element confirmed in all the opening speeches of all foreign ministers of the Polish government. So what was this all about? And no, there was nothing to consult, because it was obvious.
Potwierdzony we wszystkich expose ministrów spraw zagranicznych polskiego rządu.
To o co chodzi?
I nie było czego konsultować, bo to było oczywiste.
W ślad za dopiskiem na...
Following the note on the document, a letter was also drafted addressed to the President of the Republic of Poland by the Foreign Minister. A letter in which, even though literally expresses the opposite, the Foreign Minister actually questions the prerogatives of President Lech Kaczynski.
Kwestionuje prerogatywy prezydenta Lecha Kaczyńskiego.
In order to assure at the governmental level the proper procedure and care for the initiatives of the President of the Republic of Poland on the international stage, I would like to request that the contents of official correspondence be consulted with the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister, including in particular declarations and positions issued on behalf of the state. Such acts, the President of the Republic of Poland may also require counter-signature by the Prime Minister of the Republic of Poland. And this document, apart from being sent to the President, was also addressed by Radosław Sikorski directly to the Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
Ministrów premiera Donalda Tuska. O tym, w jaki sposób
The words of Donald Tusk, expressed almost 10 years later at a court hearing during the Smolensk trial, demonstrate the manner in which Prime Minister Donald Tusk treated the President of the Republic of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, in matters concerning foreign policy.
procesu smoleńskiego.
Politically speaking, the President, especially President Lech Kaczynski, promoted very independent foreign activity, in my view, on the verge of constitutional powers, and took political decisions. I emphasize, I may only speak on the political context here. Often, individually, without any special consultation with the government.
W kontekście politycznym, często samodzielnie i bez jakichś szczególnych konsultacji z rządem.
Szefem gabinetu prezydenta.
The head of the president's cabinet at that time was Maciej Łopiński.
To jest nierozumienie
This is a misunderstanding of the constitutional role of the President of the Republic of Poland. The care for security, international policy is clearly stipulated, not only as presidential prerogative, but also as his duty basically.
Tego typu
Such suggestions to consult with, for example, Director Brakiewicz or with other people were ridiculous because they concerned this element of Polish foreign policy, which was constant, permanent, agreed above political parties and confirmed in many speeches, votes, statements and resolutions.
W bardzo wielu wystąpieniach, głosowaniach, oświadczeniach, uchwałach.
When diplomats were discussing the plan for Georgia's and Ukraine's NATO membership, Russian provocations had been going on in the Caucasus for many months, inevitably leading to war. Their background was Russia fueling the separation from Georgia of two provinces of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which, since the fall of the USSR, has been in a dormant conflict with Tbilisi, and which Russia considered as a tool to destabilize the situation of Georgia itself. Georgi Barimidze participated in these events himself. Former Deputy Prime Minister for a certain time, Prime Minister as well as Minister of the Interior and Defense Minister of Georgia. Before that, Russia and engineering forces of the Ministry of Defense entered Georgia's territory into Abkhazia and started rebuilding a railway line. Naturally, a railway they needed for a large-scale invasion. Before that, the Russian government and the so-called President Medvedev, while actually Putin's team was in power, declared that they intend to establish direct relations with the separatist regions. Of course, it was a formal fabrication that they bombed our radar installation, and they said it wasn't them. So they were bombing Georgian villages.
So they've been bombing Georgian villages. There was nobody
from the international community who could observe the situation in the field and tell the international community what was really happening, because Russian propaganda was very active and very effective. We know how effective it had been elsewhere in the world. Can you imagine, during the war in Georgia, how effectively they could work, especially in the circumstances under which the West wanted to play with Russia, appease Russia, list concessions to Russia, just not to let Russia be too aggressive. All this made Russia more aggressive, because Russia is like a crocodile. If you give it your hand, the crocodile won't be satisfied with just your hand. The crocodile wants to swallow you completely. We have to remember what Russia did prior to the large-scale invasion to focus on us. Previously, they shot down our drone in Georgian sky, and our drone filmed how a Russian plane attacked the drone and shot it down in our airspace. The incident, referred to by the Georgian politician, took place on April the 20th, 2008, and looked like this. A report of the United Nations observation mission was drafted after this incident, according to which the plane that shot down the Georgian drone belonged to the Russian army. MiG-29 Fulcrum, or Su-27 Flanker, headed south towards the drone and the demarcation line. After intercepting and shooting down the drone, the fighter turned back north towards Maykop-Krasnodar in Russian airspace. Lack of evidence to the contrary leads to the conclusion that the fighter belonged to the Russian armed forces. The Russian Federation considered the unmanned aircraft operations carried out by Georgia in its own territory as alleged provocations, as breaking the legal status not recognized by anyone outside the Russian Federation. And that is how both the Russian media and Russian politicians presented it. Since early April, in breach of all agreements concluded, Georgian unmanned reconnaissance aircraft were constantly present in the security zone, as I am informed by the Russian peacekeeping forces and mission observers.
i obserwatorów z misji.
Rosja oskarżyła o zestrzelenie...
Russia accused NATO of shooting down the drone. It made that in a statement uttered by Dmitry Rogozin. The then Secretary General of the Pact, Jaap de Hoop Schäfer, said in response that, I quote, he would eat his own tie if it were to turn out that a NATO aircraft magically appeared in Abkhazia and shot down a Georgian drone. The NATO's chief tie eventually remained intact. However, Russian preparations for a full-scale war had already been going on for many months at the time. In mid-July, Russia started the Caucasus 2008 exercises near the Georgian borders. As part of it, the Russians gathered almost 8,000 soldiers and 700 vehicles near the borders. There were attacks against Georgia from Russia in the early 90s. In the year 91, 92, and 93. But Russia always tried to pretend that this is not Russia. These are not separatists like now. Since 2014, they've been trying in Ukraine, like in Donetsk and Luhansk. Russia had nothing to do with it. It was just the central government, separately starting the fight, so at least they tried to hide.
These forces will,
Mieli nadzieję, że te siły zdestabilizują Gruzję, zdemoralizują Gruzję i rząd Gruzji.
They hoped that these forces would destabilize Georgia, demoralize Georgia, and the Georgian government will fall down.
By the way, this was Russia's goal, as Condoleezza
By the way, this was Russia's goal. As Condoleezza Rice told Mr. Lavrov, as the US Secretary Council, that their goal was to overthrow the government of the President Saakashvili and take over the control of all of Georgia, not just where they've been claiming that there were some internal clashes.
claiming that there were some, internal clashes.
Przez cały ten okres
Throughout this period, President of the Republic of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, tried every possible opportunity to emphasize how important the status of Georgia for global security was. It's clearly depicted in this document, a memo from a meeting of the President of the Republic of Poland with the French President, Nicolas Sarkozy. President Lech Kaczynski reported on Poland's Eastern policy priorities, with particular emphasis on Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. He described Georgia as a stronghold in the Caucasus, being the gateway to all of Central Asia. If Georgia falls, we will face a domino effect. Despite the constant obstruction of the actions of President Lech Kaczynski aimed at limiting the influence and ambitions of the Russian Federation, the president loyally informed Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski, or Speaker of the Sejm Bronisław Komorowski, about his every move, as can clearly be seen in the list of addressees of this particular memo from a meeting with the French president. President Nicolas Sarkozy said that Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO was a non-disputable matter. After the Bucharest NATO summit, it is obvious. It is a matter of time when it happens. The context is important. In literally a few days, or even a few dozen hours, Sarkozy will lead the EU as the French president. That is, France will take over the presidency of the European Union. And indeed, Sarkozy will become the head of the European policy as a whole. This was the moment when the Russian-Georgian tensions around Abkhazia and South Ossetia were intensifying. Hence, the last part of Lech Kaczynski's conversation with President Sarkozy concerned Georgia. And once again, the Polish president becomes an advocate of Georgia, which is under a deadly threat from Russian Federation. And Sarkozy, well, as this future head of the European Union, actually agrees, in his words, with all that Lech Kaczynski said, and agrees that both Georgia and Ukraine should, in some perspective, join the political structures of the West.
W jakiejś perspektywie czasu znaleźć się w politycznych strukturach Zachodu. No cóż powiedzieć.
Well, what else is there to say? This memo was also sent to the Polish Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. It seems there was some sort of agreement, but as I said, it was an illusion. Moscow announced sending an additional contingent of Russian peacekeeping forces to Abkhazia and South Ossetia. In the opinion of the authorities in Tbilisi, this was the first step towards Russia seizing both Georgian and separatist republics. President Mikhail Saakashvili called the people of Abkhazia and South Ossetia to concordance and not yielding to the provocation of external forces, that is, of Russia. Tensions in the region increased after Russia first announced that it would intensify support for Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and next that it intended to increase the number of troops in these separatist regions of Georgia. Russian troops entered the rebel Republic of South Ossetia supported by Russia. It no longer was a conflict but a war. Women and children were evacuated from the capital of Ossetia. A general mobilization was announced in Georgia. We are mobilizing soldiers because we must defend the future of our homeland. Georgia was attacked because, like Ukraine, it wants to ultimately leave the Russian sphere of influence. The starting Russian aggression against Georgia meant a clash of two foreign policy visions in the Polish reality. That based on cooperation with the United States pursued by Lech Kaczynski, and that based on French and German cooperation with the Russian Federation. This vision was presented by Prime Minister Donald Tusk and his government.
Jesteś blisko wszystkich naszych myśli, staje się realne to, co nam się przyśni.
Ekipa Donalda Tuska.
The team of Donald Tusk, in relations with the Polish president, presented bad will. It was in line with what Brakiewicz himself emphasized in the memo from early March 2008 as a postulate, namely, that Polish policy should be in line with the EU's policy. That is actually of Germany and France.
Niemiec i Francji.